Good evening, everyone. We'll get started in a couple minutes here, just waiting for more folks to show up. And thank you for coming. We'll be right back.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you guys for all coming out tonight. Thank you guys for being here, taking your time out of your Tuesday to be with us. I am Anaya Taylor, and I'm one of the MCs for tonight. I'm a senior at Baltimore City College High School. I'm a student leader throughout Baltimore City. One of the organizations that we partner with today is my org called the Youth. Um, and yeah, so we're here to talk about our schools. And before we get into that, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the stress and challenges of our current environment and nationwide and in our communities. So I want to start off before we get deep into everything and just take a moment to breathe. So we're going to just inhale slowly and deeply through our noses and exhale through our mouths. And while you're doing this, what I like to do is try to feel the insides of my hands. A really good grounding technique that I like to do. So as you're breathing, try to feel like the insides of your hands, try to wiggle your toes to make sure that you're present in the moment. All right. So I want to first recognize and thank our partners who put together this town hall tonight, i.e. the Youth, Parent and Community Advisory Board of City Schools, Disability Rights Maryland, Baltimore Teachers Union, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the ACLU of Maryland. Now I'm going to pass the mic to Frank Patinella to quickly go over the program for tonight.
Hi, my name is Frank Patinella. I am a senior education advocate at the ACLU of Maryland. If you haven't noticed, we have two ASL interpreters, spotlighted speakers. You can see on your screen. There's also a Q&A tab or button at the bottom. So if you have any questions throughout, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to those and answer those questions. Bathrooms, I suppose you all know where your bathrooms are. Feel free to take a break when you need to. And again, thanks for being here. So why are we here today? We're here to talk and to provide some thoughts about Baltimore schools and the path towards equity. So what do we mean when we talk about equity? Equity is a broad term, and we all hear the term thrown around in every meeting that we attend, in every news article that we read about in schools. But there are different ideas about what that means. And in general, equity in education requires putting systems in place to ensure that every child has an equal chance for success. When we think about the context here in Baltimore, we have to understand the history and how structural racism and injustices in our current day are impacting students. We don't have the time to get into everything tonight, so we're going to limit our conversation on equity to two big topics. Number one, funding equity for Baltimore schools. And number two, equity as it relates to community inclusion in the policies and practices that affect students in the classrooms. In terms of funding equity, we're going to talk about the landmark ACLU suit, Bradford versus the State Board of Education. What is this lawsuit about? When did it start? Where are we now with the case? And what do we hope to get out of the lawsuit? Also, as part of achieving funding equity, we'll talk about the Kerwin Bill, also known as the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Bill, which was passed by the legislature last year but vetoed by the governor. Education advocacy groups are gearing up and starting to put pressure on the legislature for a full override of the veto. But is that enough? We don't think so. Based on what we know, it is clear that improvements are needed to ensure better funding equity in the short term for students who have been chronically underserved and underfunded for many generations. We'll also talk about the big issue of community as partners in the effort to ensure that schools are meeting the needs of students in Baltimore City. Baltimore parents and students all want schools that align with their hopes and dreams, schools that will support them in their aspirations for success and in college and beyond, in their careers. For that to happen, the community must be an integral part of how our school system evolves so that we can all move forward together. And with that, I'll pass it back to Anaya, who'll take us to the next part of the program.
All right. Hello. So first, I'm going to tell you guys why I am here tonight, why I decided to partner with them, with everyone for this town hall. So just like I said, I'm a senior, and throughout high school, there were just a lot of things that weren't up to par in like just my learning journey. A lot of things, a lot of issues that I had with my school in particular, or with my staff in particular, it didn't stop there. It was always a higher up power who was in control of things, and I realized that I didn't have a place in the decision making at schools. And I realized a big part of it was the fact that schools were underfunded, the fact that students don't have places to be represented, and so that is why I decided to be a part of this. So now we are going to jump in a conversation with Ajmal Qureshi, the attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund litigating the Bradford case. So, without further ado, we are going to get started if everyone is ready.
Hey everybody, this is Ajmal Qureshi. I'm an attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. Thanks so much for tuning in the midst of everything that's happening. Looking forward to talking with everyone about the Bradford case. It's Bradford v. Maryland State Board of Education, which is an important case that has to do with the adequacy of school funding in Baltimore.
All right, so first question. Ajmal, when was this lawsuit first filed, and what is it about?
This is a lawsuit that is kind of old, but also new all at once. This is a lawsuit filed in 1994 by the ACLU of Maryland, which was representing a group of parents and students in Baltimore City Public School who realized that there was a reason that there weren't enough books in their school. There was a reason that the facilities in their schools were inadequate. And there was a reason why there weren't enough teachers in their classrooms. And the reason was because the state wasn't meeting its constitutional obligation under the Maryland State Constitution to provide Baltimore City Public Schools enough funding for an adequate education. In 1996, the trial court in Baltimore concluded that students in Baltimore City public schools were not being provided an adequate education, and the Maryland Constitution was being violated. Before the case could go any further, the parties settled, or they reached a settlement, and that settlement provided an influx of cash to Baltimore City Public Schools so they could provide additional resources. Subsequently, there was legislation passed in the early 2000s, which codified some of those additional funding requirements. However, over time, beginning in around 2007, 2008, the state has slowly chipped away at funding for Baltimore City public schools. By 2015, Baltimore City public schools faced an annual deficit of $290 million. By 2017, that annual deficit, this is the amount of additional funding according to the state's own estimates that Baltimore City would need to receive to provide an adequate education, had ballooned to $342 million. This is just for books and teachers and buses and things like that. It doesn't address all of the facilities deficiencies, which are the deficiencies for the actual buildings, the air conditioning, the heating. As you all know very well, in the summer of 2000, or in the winter of 2018, there was a crisis in Baltimore City public schools where several dozen schools had to be closed. This crisis confirmed what many of you knew already and what also us advocates knew, which is that over 80% of the schools buildings in Baltimore public city schools were in inadequate condition. According to an assessment done by the city, the schools were in poor or very poor condition. So in 2019, LDF, along with the ACLU of Maryland, along with our partners at the law firm of Baker Hostetler, decided to go back into court to seek additional funding to get the state to meet its constitutional requirement to provide adequate funding for Baltimore City public schools. The case seeks not only that missing minimum of $342 million annually, but also seeks to remedy upwards of $3 billion in facility shortfall. Appreciate your patience and your time as I sort of went through the history of the case.
Okay. So next question. So I remember you saying that, there was a cut to the formula in 2008. And there was an issue with millions of dollars being cut. Isn't the state addressing this funding through the Kerwin Bill?
Great question. Thank you. So the Kerwin Bill hasn't been passed. So I think there are a couple of things there. First, we've talked about the $342 million shortfall as of 2017. The Kerwin Bill wouldn't provide that funding immediately, and certainly not in the next couple of years. They wouldn't get close to providing the $342 million until well into the 2020s. So that's several additional years of Baltimore City public schools being underfunded. That assumes that the Kerwin Bill is actually passed. As I mentioned, the Kerwin Bill, a version of the Kerwin Bill was introduced in the House and Senate, which didn't fully fund the Kerwin recommendation. So not only was the 342 not coming soon enough under the Kerwin Commission's recommendations, but now you had legislation which fell short of even what the Kerwin Commission recommended. And as you know, the governor vetoed the legislation that was passed. And so at this point, we're still seeking to get some funding, not all the funding that's required as the state has admitted, just some funding, and we haven't even been able to get that. It's going to be increasingly important, and my colleagues on the call today we'll talk more about this, that in the upcoming legislative session, we at least get something passed in terms of additional funding for Baltimore City public schools, given the severe annual shortfall the city schools face, as well as the severe facility deficiencies that impact students every day that they come to school.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me, Ashmel. So let let us back up a little bit and turn to Leslie Margolis. I really hope I pronounced that right. Another attorney that crossed paths with the Bradford team by the late 90s. The parents who were represented in the Bradford case and another lawsuit, Vaughn G, were concerned with issues beyond funding. Leslie, could you talk to us about that?
Sure, thank you. So I am a managing attorney at Disability Rights Maryland, which used to be known as Maryland Disability Law Center. And back in 1984, so way before Bradford was filed, our office filed the Von G case that dealt with special education for students with disabilities who were not getting assessments done on time or getting their individualized education plans done on time. And that litigation just went on and on and on. And in the mid to late 90s, we were actually joined with the Bradford case. We always knew that money was part of the reason why Baltimore City struggled to deliver services to students with disabilities. And our federal judge and the Bradford State Court judge were actually good friends from college, and they decided to join the cases for purposes of trial. And so we were drawn into the settlement negotiations together. And we're dealing with the funding issues and the inability of Baltimore City to appropriately serve children with disabilities.
All right, thank you so much. Next question. What was the intent of PCAB, the advisory board, and how is PCAB different from other groups that interact with the district?
Great question. So part of the settlement, as Ajmal said earlier, was increased funding for Baltimore City. But we also knew that the way to make systemic change involves multiple strategies. And one of the things that was very important to all of us was community involvement. So PCAB, the Parent Community Advisory Board, was part of the settlement that we reached with Baltimore City, and the intent was to create this board, which would have representatives that would be chosen by the ACLU, by Disability Rights Maryland. Baltimore City would have representatives, the PTA. So it would be a broad-based group that would be advisory to the Board of Commissioners. The idea was that when policies were being considered, when decisions needed to be made, this would be a broad-based board that would really have a voice in the direction that the city went in developing its policies.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That was all very, very informative. For those who are listening, if you have questions, please drop them into the chat so we can respond. Make sure we're all drinking water, taking care of ourselves as we're watching this. Now, since we're on the topic of community's partnership with the school system, let's dig a little deep. Our next item on the agenda is a panel discussion with the community, including moi. Hello. I'm going to pass the mic to Joe Kane, chair of the Parent and Community Advisory Board, PCAB. You guys have like a really cool like acronym, like PCAB.
Hey, listen, well, first of all, if we were in person, I would tell everybody, let's give Anaya a round of applause. So if you're home, let's put that energy out in the universe. Thank you. You're doing a great job this evening. But yes, thank you for welcoming me to this conversation, Anaya. I am Joe Kane, the chair of the Parent Community Advisory Board for Baltimore City Public Schools. I have 4 children who attend Baltimore City Public Schools, and I have a background on right now because those 4 children are running around behind me right now. So I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. So this evening, for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to talk about school and community partnerships, right? We learned a few moments ago the importance of the Bradford case as it seeks to really further help lay the foundation to ensure that we have full programs and resources and staffing in our schools for our children. This is an integral and very important part of a bigger picture of the process of making sure that our children have what they need. But a component that we're missing, and we have to ensure that it's always there, is meaningful engagement and inclusion of the community as it relates to important policy decisions that are made on behalf of our children. Partnerships with certain groups have gone well. We've seen that in the past, that city schools, for example, is on our side in the Bradford case. But certain groups don't feel like their voice matters, which causes stress and discord between community and the school system. All of us, administrators, teachers, parents, students, in the community at large, are interested in creating the best schools possible in Baltimore for our students. We are all stakeholders, so no one should ever feel like their concerns or ideas don't matter. So this evening, for a few moments, we're going to have a conversation with a few folk on this subject. So I want to welcome back Anaya to the conversation. She introduced herself earlier as a senior at City College High School. She represents the youth. Also, Jamie Drayton, one of our newest board members to PCAB. Ms. Drayton, I want to welcome you to the conversation. So if you can go ahead and turn your camera on. I think we have Ms. Kiera Davis Griffith. I want to welcome you to the conversation this evening as well, representing PCAB again, but as a sports seat representing Disability Rights Maryland. And we have a teacher with us representing the Baltimore Teachers Union, our dear friend Fariha Wahid. I want to welcome you to the conversation. So as we get started, y'all, I just have one question I want to throw out there to our new PCAB members, just to really take their temperature, y'all. They came on the board this past summer, and I really want to take their temperature to see how they're feeling about the situation or their role in this big equation, okay? And so, Ms. Drayton, are you there? Oh, how about Ms. Davis? Are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
How you doing this evening? Okay, I see you all made up this evening.
No, just a little bit.
Come on now, come through. Okay, listen, I want to ask you, what is the value of PCAB, and what do we want the school board and the school administrators to do differently based on your perspective this school year?
So this school year, I mean, I have a second grader who's in Baltimore City Public Schools, and this year has been different. I think every parent can agree that, you know, COVID virtual learning has been difficult. And I think the great thing about PCAB is that you have us sitting in the seat, really paying attention to a lot of the things that are going on with policy, getting onto the board meetings that, quite frankly, you probably as a parent may not have time to attend. We've dedicated ourselves to really keeping focus on the issues at hand and how we can serve our communities. This year, I would say that our biggest conversation point around Baltimore City Public Schools is transparency and communication. But the great thing about PCAB and other organizations like us is that we are pushing that issue, and we're making sure that the voices of our parents and ourselves are heard. And that has been, I mean, it's only October, and I feel like I've been on this board for years now, because we really, every day, that's the conversation we're having. How can we provide students with the resources that they need? Do they know that these resources exist? Do they know that this is happening? And it's been amazing. It's been amazing to really have your hand on just making your community, your school communities, and the whole district a better system.
No doubt, definitely. Thank you for sharing that experience. And Ms. Drayton, are you with us yet? Because last PCAB meeting, we had a school board commissioner on with us, and you really gave an impromptu, off-the-cuff, spirited, I don't know what you want to call it, contribution to the conversation. And I'm curious what you think about this question. Okay, cool. She may not be there. That's fine. But as a
can you hear me?
Yes. Hey, how are you doing this evening?
Yay! Sorry about that. So sorry. So my name is Jamie Drayton, and I have 3 children, 2nd, 6th, and 7th grade in Baltimore City Public Schools. And I try not to be as spirited as Joe is making me out to be. I'm just extremely passionate about my children, and I'm extremely passionate about other people's children because you don't get this time back. And this little pre-K through 12th grade, it's a very short window to put what we want these children to have in them and to set them up for the world. And I feel like Baltimore City, we have the best kids ever, right? We have the best parents, we have the best educators, but sometimes we are not up for the challenge when it comes to giving them the best that we got to send them out there. So it breaks my heart when I have to tell people not so much how to do their job, but don't catch an attitude with your constituents. That's one thing I won't tolerate. That don't even make sense. But to answer your question, Joe, because you got me fired up, I try not to be fired up. This year has definitely been a challenge. My children actually attend Montebello Elementary and Middle School, and they have amazing teachers. Like the second grade teachers, amazing. My children's, I mean, just amazing. But the school board has been a different situation this year. I mean, just constantly transparency issues, like Kiara mentioned. And really, I think what's been difficult for me is everyone understands that this is a year of transition and a year of issues, right? It's not just a month, it's not a season, it's a whole year at this point. So I expected issues like, okay, we're gonna have issues with transportation, right? They have to figure out how to clean stuff. They're gonna have to figure out staffing. I didn't expect deceit or, I won't say deceit, transparency issues. Like, I'm expecting you to mess up, but I want you to know that's what parents are here for. Like, you're supposed to walk us with you in the battle, right? These are our kids, and together we're going to get them, to the promised land. So that's been kind of interesting, and I want our people to know. And I call our system, right? It's an ecosystem of teachers, and an ecosystem of board members, and an ecosystem of students. I want us to be together. You know what I mean? I want us to be in the fight together. And I think that's what's so interesting every time I hear about the Bradford case and ACLU and it's amazing to me that it's not, okay, this person's fighting for the donations and this person's fighting for, the media. We're in it together. We get success together. And that's the part that I get excited about. I'm done. Okay.
Listen, I told the people that you had a spirited contribution to this conversation. So I really appreciate you sharing it with us this evening. But as a teacher, Fariha, explain to us some good things, right? We are definitely highlighting the opportunities for growth here, but what are some things that you've seen work well?
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. So, I just want to acknowledge some of the positives. I just want to say that leading a school district, especially during a pandemic, has got to be one of the hardest jobs in the world to do. And I just want to take a moment to really acknowledge the innovation and the equity of outcomes that the district's plan has proposed thus far. Up until right now, even today, we've talked about the significant budget shortages that city schools is facing. And even still, city schools really has partnered with various groups and agencies to make sure our students have meals, because we know sometimes schools are the only place our babies are getting fed. They've also really tried to expand internet access to everyone. We know the pandemic has just really exacerbated some inequities that have always existed. And lastly, I think the school system is really, really striving to make sure that we promote the outcomes of educational outcomes, right? So Frank in the opening really talked about equity and equity of outcomes. So I think the school district has really promoted educational equity in its outcomes. And I think that's why they keep pushing for in-person learning. We know that, COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting Black and Brown people. We know it's disproportionately impacting working class and low-income people. And I think that's why the board and why Dr. Santelises has continued to push for in-person instruction, because, virtual learning is not working for everyone. But I just wish the board also considered not only equity of educational outcomes, but also looked at equity of health outcomes, because, opening up these in-person learning opportunities is really putting our students and our educators and really the entire community at really great risk. In addition, when I look at equity, I really look at it as, are we getting the outcomes? And also, what does the process to get to equity look like? And I think there's room for improvement for the entire board to really consider more equity in the process. You know, when we look at who should be involved in decision making, I think it absolutely has to be educators, it has to be students, it has to be families and community members. In order to kind of, you know, upturn the system, we have to look at who has been historically neglected and marginalized. And those people need to be brought up to the decision making table. Those people need to be given authentic decision making power to prioritize all of the problems that are happening right now, and most importantly, come up with innovative solutions to those problems.
Wow, thank you for that meaningful response, Doctor. We really appreciate that. Love your background. But, you know, Anaya, as I turn to you, you know, at our last private meeting about this, you pointed out that, you know, we worked together on Be More Live. And I wanted to tell folk that this is one of the dopest, youngest activists in our city, right? But to hear you say that you didn't really know your space, right? Or how you can give feedback or be part of the decision-making process, that kind of took me aback a little bit. So, you know, you are a PCAB member, right? But tell me, do you feel like students have a voice in the decision-making process? And explain to us, is there an effective way students can be partners with the school district?
You know, I feel like that question, Dewey, is such like an objective question, because it's like, you know, there's do we have the ability? And I feel as though there's, you know, we don't have that voice, but we have the ability to get there. I always say, like Ms. Drayton said, like, you cannot not talk to your constituents. You can't not communicate. Like, you're in service of us. And I think sometimes the district gets lost in translation of what exactly should and shouldn't happen. And it's funny, I was talking to Frank earlier a few days back about how it's a very top-down hierarchical stance of the way decisions get made. And we should be on that top-down hierarchy. I feel as though there's data points are the biggest thing that they care about when you're looking from a student's eye perspective. I honestly feel like they're like, oh, all of these things that we're getting to get this better education, but are you making better people? Like, yes, you want them to get these good grades, but are they okay? Are they, like, equitable health doesn't just stop at, you know, the physical bodily health. It also goes into mental health. It goes into mental well-being, because we can't get you these data points that you want if we're not okay at home, but you'll never know that if you don't talk to us. And so I've always been a huge advocate of, you know, you understanding who you're working for, and how to, you know, create that communication to bridge the gap, because that's going to be a big issue when you're making all of these decisions. Like, yeah, you think this will work, but you've never tried it, and you don't know the students that you're about to try this with. So how do we understand, like, where do we go from here? Like, how do we get these things? Like, if we were to pass, you know, this Bradford lawsuit, well, then where do you go from there? Like, okay, we got this money, but what do we do with it? Like, how do you know that this is what we're supposed to be doing with it? Like, how do you know that this is going to get you the outcome that you want? And what is the outcome that you want? And what if the outcome that the district want isn't the outcome that the students want? Like, there are so many students that I know right now, and I'm in my senior year, that want to drop out. We don't want to go to college. College is a scam. I know a lot of people who dropped out of college because they thought that was a scam, but that's because we weren't built for it. We weren't raised for it. We weren't given the tools for it. There are so many people who went to these private schools who were given the tools for it, but that's because they had the money for it. And that's because they communicated. They had so many community things. Parents actually participated in these things. PCABs were successful in other cities, but that's because the district listened to them. Mm-hmm. And so none of this matters. This lawsuit doesn't matter. This talk doesn't matter. This town hall doesn't matter if the follow through doesn't come, if you talking to the students doesn't happen, because what will happen is we won't care anymore because we're drained already. All of the successful times that I've had as a student came from middle school, because that's where the best communication happened. I still talk to all of my middle school teachers, even my middle school principals. Like, I'm invited to their weddings. Like, we have such a close community within that space that nothing can combat that all the, like, my middle school was great because I loved my teachers. I love my administrative council. And I feel like we can get there with the district. We can get there with high school. We just have to want to. And I feel like, you know, we aren't pushing them enough and they don't understand enough. So building an understanding and understanding that we're all learning and unlearning, like this is such a hard time to be in when none of us know what we're doing. So understanding that, you know, just like how I'm messing up, you're messing up, and we just understand that and we know that, and it's okay. We can just work together to get to point Z. So yeah.
Listen, again, thank you for that really dope contribution. And I just realized that the organizers put me on a panel with 4 strong women, and I just gotta sit here and be quiet while y'all talking over the time, okay? I gotta just be quiet, but I thank y'all. But I'm gonna turn to our teacher for a minute and ask you a question. Can you give an example of when a time when the teaching community, right, felt included in decisions with the district? And what experiences have been good?
Sure thing. So just for context for folks, I'm a special educator currently working at an elementary school. This is now my 7th year in city schools. And I'm also really proud to serve as the vice president of elementary schools in the Baltimore Teachers Union. So, you know, throughout the last 6+ years, I have really seen so many examples of school leaders and district leaders really do a really fantastic job of making sure their community feels valued and authentically engaging their teachers, their educators, their students, and their whole community in decisions. You know, like Anaya just talked about her middle school, and you could see her whole face light up. Like she felt like a really valuable member of that community. And I think there's so many pockets where this is happening, but I think overall, like this is a huge area of growth for our district overall. I think that we have, you know, examples of people really doing the work well, but it's not being replicated across the entire district. And you asked me to name like a positive example. Again, it's happening on a smaller scale, but you know, the large scale examples, people are really frustrated and they don't feel like their voices are heard. For example, the reopening conversation is kind of on everybody's mind right now. And you know, a lot of educators called me just like crying and complaining because they found out about our district's reopening plan through the Baltimore Sun. Just take a second for that to like sit with you. As educators in the system, we found out about the reopening plan through our local newspaper, not through official communication channels, not from the source. And then later on, when we did get clarity from our school district, it was different than what we read about in the Baltimore Sun. So it caused a lot of confusion and a lot of chaos. And you know, if you're trying to garner community buy-in and make people feel important, I think like transparent communication is absolutely the first step.
Listen, thank you, thank you. And I remember that morning, that was a crazy, stressful morning. But I do want to turn to our DRM rep for a moment. And we talk about you know, students with disability and advocating for those students in our district. You know, how has the school district worked with disability advocates, community, and parents?
Well, DRM, as the Protection and Advocacy Agency, provides legal assistance and advocacy to Baltimore City families. They're also involved in ongoing meetings and discussions related to COVID-19 pandemic with Baltimore City Public Schools Legal Office, as well as their Special Education Office. They meet regularly with council and special education leadership to discuss COVID-related, education-related issues. And they meet regularly to discuss the status of cases and policy issues. Myself, I'm actually one of 3 DRM appointees to PCAB, and our job is really to just present ourselves to the community so that our advocacy work within Baltimore City Public Schools is meaningful. We are involved in PCAB and our school communities because not only do we have our own stories surrounding our own students and their disability, but we have friends who have the same scenario, and we take it very seriously. All of our experiences are different, but our position as appointees are to keep an eye out on behalf of families that have a student with disabilities.
No doubt. Thank you for explaining that to us. And you know, here, this next question is really an open-ended one that we can go on for miles with this response. But I'm gonna go to you, Ms. Drayton. Like, why is there a perception, right, that the community voice is not valued in city schools, and right? And then on the other half, the solution side, like, how can that be improved?
Well, I think, and people might not agree with me, but this is just my personal feelings. I think sometimes when your complexion is different, and when it's brown, people just don't care. And, you know, even sometimes it's our own people that are very dismissive of Black and brown parents. Like, you're not going to show up, so this is not our problem. And that's why sometimes you get a response when someone does show up to a school board meeting and calling people out. And I've had that happen personally. You know, a principal is dismissive of you. They don't have time to meet with you. They don't want to talk about you, talk about the school. They don't got time. But then when you show up to the school board meeting, you get a phone call, you get an email, someone nods at you at the John on 41st Street. It's ridiculous. And at this point, I think because we don't always band together as parents collectively and use and harness that power, it's easy to dismiss us. But like I tell people, I came from Montgomery County. I had a very different experience of how parents are treated. I mean, just down to communication. Some things would just not happen. And some things, you know, you could just sit down and talk to the principal or talk with a teacher or talk with a district representative. They could not dismiss you. And I think that's the main issue, is this idea that we can dismiss or ignore parents who trust their children with our school system. So I think once we learn that we respect these people, regardless of their education level, regardless of an addiction, regardless of if they're a grandparent or a foster parent, regardless of all the other stuff, respect. Once respect becomes that baseline and we're here for mutual understanding, those issues will get together. Because, you know, to go back to Ms. Wahid, I think about the Baltimore Sun. You're not talking to parents in the Baltimore Sun. Let's be real. You're talking, like, you know what I mean? Who are you talking to when you put out an article in the Baltimore Sun? You know what I mean? That's a very specific stakeholder. And I get it. You know, when people want to communicate with the business community, when they want to communicate with our folks downtown, that's where they go. They go to the BBJ, they go to the Baltimore Sun. But when you want to talk to your parents, you have everyone's email, you have everyone's text message, and we're all home. So you can't use that as an excuse to say you didn't have the chance to communicate with your people. You did. You chose not to, and it was deliberate. So I get it. You know, it's not personal, right? It's business. So what I'm saying is, once we realize that our business is our students, and then we're going to take it real personal, then we can get back to that mutual level and say, you know what? If we're looking to really talk about equity, we got to believe in that at home first, and not just for a grant proposal. You know, we got to do the work and get down to it, roll up our sleeves and say, okay, you know what? Culturally, our parents might not come out to a PTA meeting if we have a PTA or a PTO, but there is a way to get to them. And we know who will show up and who we can go to and go to their house and knock on the door, or which grandparents we can call. Because I've heard some grandparents cursing people out on these webinars to get these Zoom calls to get your stuff together. And guess what? The kids who are on Zoom, you can talk to their parents there. I've had plenty of occasions. People just don't try. And I think that's the part that hurts the most. You know, we're not Howard County. We're not Montgomery County. We're not even Prince George's County, even though we have, you know, comparable statistics. We are Baltimore City, and we should be proud of that and not be a victim. You know, and really just empowering our parents, empowering our students, and saying, you know what, we're going to keep pushing. We're going to keep trying for growth. We're going to keep trying and forget the surveys. You know, if I get another survey, I'm going to scream. We're going to keep trying to find out where our community is. And if I can't hit you with a billboard, I'm going to knock on your door with some gloves and a mask like Amazon Prime. I'm going to do something. You know what I mean? And that's what gets me like so heated. I've been home for 10 months locked indoor with my kids, and I love them. God bless them. But I've been here, like most of the people in Baltimore City. So if you can't find me now, you're not going to find me when we return to school.
That's right.
I'm done. Thank you, sir.
Listen, that's why we turn to you, you know, and I'll just say, you know, I remember being that parent entering a city school and like, who's in charge, and really not leaving until I literally left with a key to the school. I still have that key, right? Like we have to make sure that we as parents and community members and teachers, right? We all are in this together. And so we really have to make sure that we are being intentional and strategic about this. And I'll say this last thing before I go to Anaya for a second. I remember in January 2018 at Dunbar High School, when we didn't have any heat in schools, and there was a parent who stood up, there was this big town hall talking about heat. And this parent stood up and talked, she wanted to talk about why her child didn't get accepted into the school of their choice, right? And of course, all the people, the staff were like, oh no, this is not what we're talking about. And Dr. Santelises, in her wisdom and experience, stopped her staff and said, let this parent talk. Let this parent talk. She came out here in the cold, the winter, to talk about her child. We're going to listen to her. Go get her name and figure out the answer. I mean, that's what our response has to be. It has to be very intentional and take into consideration the circumstances that we face here in Baltimore. A unique cookie cut solution will not fit. So we had to be intentional. But I really want to point out, Anaya, you've had some success in putting your hypothetical foot on people's neck as down North Avenue, right? In the creation of a board. Tell us about this board.
Listen, I, just like any other parent, don't appreciate when they don't listen, right? So I used to like chase my principal. When I say chase, I literally mean I skipped class, stalked my principal, stayed like 20 feet away, and me and my friend Olivia, we would chase our principal, our vice principal, and she just like, they wouldn't listen. And so I was at a point where I felt like everything they did was reactive instead of proactive. Once the revolution started with everything with Black Lives Matter, that's when they decided to discuss racism in the school. And I was like, we're not gonna do this. And so an email got sent out to that principal, very lengthy one, talking about how I didn't appreciate her. And it ended up turning into I think someone from North Avenue contacted me and was like, let's talk about this. And they brought all some students together and they were like, okay, so what are the concerns? And we all voiced them. And my issue was that they were in service of us and they did not understand that. And they was like, so what can we do to remedy this? And I know Tracy Durant was on the phone, Dr. Santelises was there, Rashad Staten, and another person who I can't remember. And they were like, okay, let's form this space where students feel like they're literally next to me. And thus came the CEO Leadership Advisory Board. And if I'm not mistaken, this was like the first time that they've done this specifically. They've had, the student board with the student commissioner and stuff like that. And I love Josh and they were great, but this needed to happen. And so they sent out, they were like, Anaya, let's do this. We'll talk to you. We'll put the application out. We'll have you fill out the application. You'll join the board. And essentially this board was supposed to be made up of like 30 something youth, let's say 30 something. And from all over, and to say like they were liaisons of the schools, liaisons of the communities, liaisons of different places. So now this is like the glue, the bridge of the gap that I was talking about earlier. Like this is how we create that communication. So now we have PCAB, and now you have the CEO Leadership Advisory Board, and now you have me, Anaya Taylor, yelling down your throat until I go off to college. So you can't not listen to us. Like there's no way you can't hear us now because we're in your face. And so I think that this is one of the things where they'll give us something and then they'll just drop the ball and it's there. And we can't allow that to happen with this board. We can't allow that to happen with PCAB. Like we can't just exist there and that be enough, because sometimes that happens. They're like, oh, we gave you this board, but you didn't really give us the power to really utilize it to the best of our ability. And so that's the next step, is making sure that the things that they gave us, well, they actually have value, they have worth. We actually have a voice with this board and not just a place in it.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I think this is such a common conundrum that not just Baltimore City schools is seeing, but something that's really happening across the United States of America. And I think it's because our entire education policy system is so top down,
Oh yeah.
Federal level comes up with all the policies, like schooling is very Eurocentric. And so when you teach in Baltimore and when you have students and families who are ready to fight and ready to talk about how, we want the curriculum to look like this. A lot of times, like superintendencies and boards and people in leadership don't even know what to do because they're so used to the top-down structure that's really like focusing on compliance. And I think like when you're focusing on compliance, the other thing that you forget is how to do bottom-up change. You forget how to look at the Anayas of the world and take their considerations and their ideas and actually put it into practice.
And with Joe, the question that you asked earlier is like, why is there such a disconnect? Like, why isn't it there? It's, just simply like the idea that it's not there, the power structure of it all. Like Ms. Drayton said, it's the color, but I also think like it's the power. Like we're all like, if we look at the North Avenue, it's not like thousands of white people. Like Dr. Santelises is Black, Tracy Durant Black, like all of them are Black. So we can't say it's that. It's the idea that we don't hold them accountable for the little bit of power that they really have, and knowing that once we realize that we are the ones that hone the power within the system, that it's not top down, that it is bottom up. Like if we all decided to stop sending our kids to school, to stop, like they lose the power. So understanding that and keeping that, like that's where the problem comes. And so, holding them accountable and understanding that, we're the ones with everything, that'll really change. Like I really feel like everything is gonna run smoothly once we realize that like we're literal like superheroes and that this is a community and it's gonna be all right.
Well, thank you, Angela Davis. Anaya. You definitely put a cherry on that one. I do want us to talk for briefly, and I'm gonna give each of y'all 30 seconds to answer this question, right? When you think about, we talked about kind of the structural things within this district that impact on just the relationship or tension that's created between the district and stakeholders. But what are some external factors? I can name one, just thinking about how the Baltimore City public schools has been chronically underfunded for decades, right? And we hear that it's a talking point, but that really everybody adds up to lives and students and children and generations of people who have gone through a failed, quote unquote, failed system, And so what are some other external factors that kind of impact just this relationship? And
I'll add one. So you talk about the underfunding of schools. If we look at the economic status of a lot of our families, they can't choose another option. So they're stuck in this situation. So when you put them in a pandemic, private school isn't an option. Tutoring isn't an option. Pandemic pods aren't an option. They have to sit and hope and pray that Baltimore City gets it together. It's a disaster waiting to happen.
That's a good one. Anybody else want to chime in?
I can chime in. I think the structure with how we come up with it and implement education policy is totally backwards. I think it has to shift from top down to really bottom up. Like currently, honestly, like working in K through 12 schools, I feel like a robot. Like I'm a special education teacher and I'm responsible for some very significant outcomes. And, we have so many structural elements in place, like inadequate funding and racism and biases and all of these things that are really stacking the odds against me and my students. But all of that doesn't matter. I still have to get my students to where the system needs them to be. And so even though I have to produce all of these outcomes, I have very little flexibility in any of the inputs. So as teachers, we don't design the curriculum that we teach. It's not culturally relevant. Most of our students don't see themselves or their identities affirmed and honored, and they get disengaged very quickly. In addition to that, I don't set the growth goals or the targets that I want my students to meet. I don't design my instructional schedule. I don't even pick the tests that my students get or decide when I'm testing them. All of these things have already been decided for me by our top-down system. So, what needs to change? I think that needs to change. I think educators and the entire community really need to get more decision-making power to match the people power that we have. And I think that's the only way we're going to change education and shift the needle. But this level of micromanagement right now, I think it really stifles my creativity. It makes my students no longer engaged in class. And I think overall, it makes educators and students feel less valued. And I think it's actually really, really harmful and reduces our educational outcomes.
Listen, first of all, I want to thank you all for just being great panelists this evening. I'm sure, I've gained a lot just hearing you four women talk about just your perspective on this topic. And as we close this segment, I really want to offer a few things, right? The biggest thing that first thing I want to offer is that when we are talking about our school system, we have to make sure that all of our decision, all of our energy, all of our effort is centered around children, right? We need to make sure that children are our top priority not our advancement in whatever organization or career. It's about the children. I went to Baltimore City Public Schools. My wife went to Baltimore City Public Schools. My kids, my parents, like this is people's real lives. The second thing is that, you know, we have to be willing to have the hard conversations. When we started this school year, I told the school board quite honestly that this was going to be a lap around Montebello Lake, meaning that, you know, I'm out of shape. So we're going to be accountability partners to make on this journey of this school year. We're going to be accountability partners to hold each other accountable when we're falling short, not meeting our commitment goals, or when we need a little encouragement, and then reward you and compliment you when you do the right thing. That's what accountability looks like. So we had to be willing to have those hard conversations because we're inextricably linked, right? It can't be us versus them. It has to be all of us together. PCAB will be working on this. There will be an announcement soon about how folk can just join PCAB and be part of this exercise of accountability, right? Then we have to think about transitioning into the legislative session. We know that we can talk about all the things that we need, but that costs money. And so we have to make sure that we're doing our part in Annapolis, and quite frankly, parents and community members and stakeholders, we've been good partners. When you think about last few years, Fix the Gap, Kerwin, Heaton School, we've been there supporting our school district side by side in Annapolis. So we have to get ready for that. And then the last thing is that we have to make sure that we're building partnerships so we can have great outcomes in city schools. And then and before I'll go to Frank and he give us his blueprint presentation, I'll leave us with this last word. If anybody remembers, Frank Conway Sr. used to always say, a wise old owl sat on an oak. The more he heard, the less he spoke. The less he spoke, the more he heard. Why aren't we all like that wise old bird? Listen, you all have a good evening. Let's be like that wise old bird and our journeys for accountability and great outcomes. Have a good evening. Frank?
Thank you, Mr. Kane, and to our panelists. I hope that the folks who are interested in community inclusion as it relates to education policies and practice can connect with PCAB and with Anaya and our youth leaders and with Disability Rights Maryland. So we're going to shift gears and talk about funding equity. The legislative session in Annapolis starts in January. This is when the governor and state legislators determine new policies and the budget for next school year. The community has played an important role over the past couple decades in fighting back cuts to education and securing additional funding to fill gaps. And the state took years to pass the blueprint for Maryland's future. And when they finally did pass it earlier this year, it was vetoed by the governor. And given the impact of the pandemic, there are big issues on the agenda this year that will have significant implications on how well schools in Baltimore are funded. So if you look at the PowerPoint there, we're looking at, for the General Assembly 2021, we're looking at really improving funding equity. And you heard Ajmel talk about the Bradford lawsuit, which is about funding adequacy. And just to make a distinction here, adequacy in terms of how it is defined legally is the amount of money needed to ensure that students can meet the standards passed by the state. So right now, the blueprint bill, which is a $4 billion sweeping education reform bill, it's mostly about resources, funding and resources and programming. That is, we can't say right now whether that is going to meet the constitutional standard. And there is a 10-year phase-in of the funding that will go statewide to every district, including Baltimore City. We're going to work through the Bradford process, and that's more of a longer-term issue. But we have to be concerned about the short-term issue. So when I look at what's on the docket for Annapolis this year, the short-term funding is for funding for FY22. That's fiscal year 22 or school year 21-22. So it's the next school year. We have to be concerned about funding. And this is about addressing gaps in the budget for Baltimore schools. It's about addressing learning loss and the digital divide. And the legislature is also going to look at overriding the veto. And we're hearing good things about the veto being overridden in both the House and the Senate. And so that bill can go forward. But with that, there's going to be some kind of companion legislation or corrective bill to adjust the phase-in amounts, because now we're a whole fiscal year off and they have to revise how the funding is phased in. Let me see the next slide. Okay, before we talk about the specifics, I wanted to show you this chart. If you look at the bottom, you see counties in Maryland. It starts with Caroline, then Wicomico, Somerset, all the way up to Worcester County. From left to right is the lowest wealth districts to the highest wealth districts. And according to the state's own measure of adequate funding, you can see where districts fall based on those target levels. So the lowest wealth districts, you can see that midline, those districts are the least well-funded. And as the districts increase in wealth, more of those districts are closer to the center or the midline, so they're better funded. And some of them are above their target adequacy funding level. Now, I'm not talking about this target level as being exactly what each district needs, because this is the old formula, the Thornton formula. And these are numbers from fiscal year 17. We're in fiscal year 20, 21, and 22 coming up. So we know that the shortfall in funding is larger now. But this is the only way we can compare all districts in terms of where they fall on that adequacy level. And you can see the low wealth districts need a lot more help. They're the most under, they're standing in the deepest holes. They've had the hardest time adjusting to the pandemic and providing remote learning for all students. Things like that. And even pre-pandemic, there are significant disparities in terms of outcomes for students statewide. So particular attention has to be paid to the districts that are the least funded. Can we get next slide? So the short-term funding issues for FY22, again, this is for the next school year. There was a small Kerwin Bill passed in 2019 before they passed the larger Kerwin Bill earlier this year. This bill wasn't vetoed. It provided money for FY20 and FY21. And there was a number of things that were funded in those bills, in that bill. Some of you may know that there are 80 new community schools in Baltimore City. That came from this legislation. There's additional healthcare professionals in our schools. There's grants for pre-K, special education. There was a bump in teacher salary. And there's transitional supplemental grants, which basically grants for additional tutoring for students who are behind in the early grades. That funding should continue this year. There's $370 million mandated for the Blueprint Fund. So this is a specific fund that this money will be put in by the governor. The governor is mandated to put that amount in for FY22. However, the funding is not appropriated. So it's important that the governor continue these programs that were started under the small Blueprint bill. But there's no guarantee that would happen. So we're working with coalitions now and meeting with legislators and sending letters to the governor. A lot of advocates are working on this issue just to make sure that these Kerwin programs that were started will continue, because otherwise we'd be pulling out the rug under students and schools that have gained these programs in those recent years. Then there's another $130 million that was set aside in this bill, but it's contingent upon revenue projections that we'll know in December 2020. This is the Wayfair tax and some other things. Really, we have to look at the revenue projections in December December next month, to know whether or not the revenues are there to support this level of contribution to the Blueprint Fund? And if so, this money, again, we need to focus on the students that have experienced the most learning loss during the pandemic. Also, the students who are just behind and have been, pre-pandemic been struggling. And what we see, in the Kerwin Bill that was vetoed, if you look at the phase-in of money, it doesn't match. It doesn't prioritize those districts that are the worst funded. There needs to be better equity in terms of how that money is directed. So, with this 370 million and hopefully 130 million, we can focus on those struggling learners and the districts standing in the deepest holes. Additional funding gaps to address. We know that this year, city schools in adjusting their budget to implement remote learning, they let go of 450 temporary staff in schools. I've talked to a number of parents, teachers, and school communities across the district, and I'm hearing that these are really important staff. The district didn't want to cut them, but they had to make budget adjustments. But these aren't temporary staff as in they go away. Some of them have been there for many years. They work in the front offices. They reach out to parents when kids don't come to schools. They help families with other things, other stressors and barriers to learning that come up. So these gaps in funding have to be addressed. Also, the district spent a lot of money on remote learning and the digital divide. They bought hotspots, they bought and distributed thousands and thousands of devices throughout the district. That costs money, and it came from somewhere within the budget. So we're hearing that there's going to be some kind of digital divide bill that would provide money for districts for these needs. They also have to think about reimbursing districts that have spent a lot of money on this issue, because not every district had the same level of need there and challenges. And there's also, most districts across the state have experienced enrollment loss. Either parents have chosen private education or gone to another district to send their kids. Some of them may have some of them might be in more serious situations and they're not even attending school. So on the books, that means a loss of enrollment. And when the enrollment runs through the education funding formula, that means a loss of funding. So pretty much all districts we're hearing are asking for a full hold harmless for enrollment loss. So that means not even recognizing the enrollment that's on the books for this year and instead using the previous years. And any additional funding that is needed to provide more resources for under-resourced students and students with the most learning loss, that has to be identified, and there should be money in the budget to address those needs. Next slide. So the legislature is also going to be making decisions that will affect the medium term. So funding for not next school year, but the school year after, and that's fiscal year 23 and beyond. And this is the blueprint for Maryland's future bill. This is the Kerwin Bill that was vetoed by the governor. We support a full override of the governor's veto. And with that, we understand that there's going to be a Kerwin correction bill. And we support improving funding equity in terms of the phase-in of that $4 billion and greater funding priority in the early years for the students that need the most support, and funding priority in the early years for the districts that are most underfunded. Okay. And just, again, the overall funding adequacy of the blueprint funding formula will be determined. That's a longer term issue, and we'll keep folks up to date in terms of where we are in the Bradford case. We have Bradford town halls, public town halls every quarter. So we look forward to giving you those updates. And a couple other things that are going to be on the agenda for Annapolis is House Bill 1, the Built to Learn Act. It's a $2.2 billion school construction bill. This bill was attached to the blueprint bill. So when the blueprint bill was vetoed by the governor, the Built to Learn Act was also vetoed. But just to give you a picture of what the school buildings, the condition of school buildings in Baltimore City is in blue. These are the schools that are being addressed by the $1 billion 21st Century Schools program. And this was passed in 2013. The ACLU and many groups worked on passing this bill. And it will, in the end, within a couple years, about 30 schools would have been rebuilt or completely fully renovated. There were only 16 schools in good condition before we passed that bill. And with no funding really at all, or not much funding, are the buildings in red. And that's over 80 schools that are in very poor condition. A lot of them have ancient boilers. Some of them don't have air conditioning at all. The roofs are out of date. Many of them are leaking. They need to be replaced. We need a funding stream for this. So the Built to Learn Act could do somewhere between 8 and a dozen schools. We'll see. It depends on how large the schools that are selected are, and what the bond market is doing, because this how much you can borrow depends on the bond market. But we hope to see that $2.2 billion pass so we can address some of these schools in very poor condition. Next slide, please. So the first thing there is the Built to Learn Act. We support the override, so that can go forward. And out of that, the city will see somewhere around $420 million, along with the other large school districts. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight this issue. If anyone's interested in working on this issue, we're happy to talk to you. But this is about removing the school resource officers from schools. We support the removal of school resource officers, and we're working with a lot of partners on that. We believe this is an equity issue, in that police officers in schools don't serve the purpose of educating kids. We want to make sure that those resources, that funding is going to professionals that are helping to build up children and support children, instead of getting them tied up into the legal system. So that's an overview of the legislative priorities. You can reach us at the ACLU. I'll provide my email address. Anyone who's willing to work on these issues with us, please reach out. And with that, I will pass it back to Anaya, because now we want to hear from you.
Hello. And when he says you, he means you beautiful people. So now that we've been talking the entire time and our voices and throats are dry, we are going to hear from you. We're going to break out into small groups. There's going to be a facilitator in each group, and we want to get your answer to these questions. 1, reflect on what you heard. Did anything resonate? What didn't you hear? What does it look like to have schools that are safe and inclusive and responsive to your needs? And then we're gonna have a few yes or no questions, like if you wanna get involved, what you're interested in, things about the Bradford lawsuit. So in a minute, we're gonna get started. And that was my mom that just walked by. Now she's walking by again. Hello, mother. So whenever you guys are ready, we're gonna start these breakout rooms. Goodbye, mother.
Yeah, so again, everyone should have gotten, actually, let me resend it, apologies. There is a Zoom link that just went into the chat, and that's where we're gonna go into our breakout rooms. So if everyone can click on the Zoom link that's in the chat. We're basically gonna switch rooms from a webinar to a Zoom meeting, and then we'll be in our breakout rooms for about 30 minutes with these discussion questions, and then wrap up.